Hello and welcome back to LTC Heroes Live by Experience Care. My name is Peter Murphy Lewis. Today I'm excited to be interviewing a person who has experience in our industry, in our industry as an academic, as an advocate, and a number of job titles that I don't know what they are. So let me introduce our guest. Stephen Chise is a former COO for a faith-based long-term care organization providing services to 7,000 individuals on 40 campuses. He's also a former aide to United States congressman and has held numerous leadership positions with professional trade and advocacy organizations. Stephen has been actively engaged in the advancement of long-term care or administration and excellence. He's an ACA Baldrige examiner, and in his spare time, he enjoys fly fishing, something I've never done well, traveling, which I love, and biking. Stephen, welcome to LTC Heroes.
Thanks, Peter. Great to be here.
Stephen, you and I started talking, I think about 2 months ago, and I'm excited that you gave me that amount of time to prepare for this because I've been going through your book. You have an interesting book. I would say that it was, how would I say it? It was the detail that I needed, and I learned enough about the history, but I also learned about the future. You have a number of different jobs, and we'll go around there. But let's get started just as kind of an entry level. How did you get into long-term care? Can you take me back in as much detail as you feel comfortable and remember? Be like, what was your first day? Who was the first person who told you about it?
Well, my family has actually been in the long-term care business for 60 years. My dad was a building contractor and was building skilled nursing facilities back in the 60s. And I got my first exposure both working in construction on those buildings, but also helping to set them up. So I was not what you would call a great high school student. I, struggled along in high school and ended up in 1970, number 7 in the draft, and ended up in the military for 2 years on active duty and 2 years on inactive duty, and then 2 years on active reserve duty. And during that time, going from being a relatively unmotivated student, having lived in a combat area for a year, it kind of changes your perspective on life. So when I got out, I finished up my undergraduate degree and started my master's degree and was trying to decide what I wanted to do. And my dad at the time, who was probably one of the smartest practical attorneys, being a contractor, everybody sues you, basically said, this is what you should look at. This is an interesting field to get into. So he made me a deal. He offered to sell me 2 of the buildings that he had, along with myself and my siblings, and if I would become an administrator. So I took some classes while I was at the university and ended up getting my license and operating one of our buildings for about 22 years. So, I ran into a lot of interesting people, a lot of people that mentored me over the years. When people ask me, how did you get to where you're at? I basically have said that with a liberal arts background, liberal arts teaches you to question everything and ask questions to be able to learn. So when I've had a chance to do things, whether it was working for the congressman or working for the Catholics or doing the other things that I've done in my career, I've seen it as an opportunity to learn, gain new skills, gain new knowledge, and then try to apply them in different settings that I'm participating in. So that's kind of the abbreviated version of where I got from point A to point B and going on to point Z.
Talk to me a little bit about when you started off as an administrator, were these interruptions where you work for a congressman or then get into academia, or were these on the side in parallel?
So 1975, I got my administrator's license and took over the facility. And during that about 10-year period of time, we went from this little 69-bed rural facility to a 104-bed facility focusing on rehabilitation and Medicare. We were one of the first facilities to be surveyed under the new federal regulations. So I had all of those experiences that I went through, including a certificate of need programs and a major construction project. So by the time I got to 1985, a friend of mine, Jerry Sikorsky, who was the congressman for my area, and I'd gotten to know Jerry as a senator in Minnesota. He also happened to be a nursing assistant while he was in college. So he had some interest in senior care, and he ended up being a good colleague and a friend. He asked me if I would help him out running his district office and working on some senior care issues. So I took a 1-year sabbatical in 1985 to work with him, and I had a chance to work on some senior care issues and some natural resource issues. Of course, we've got the boundary waters in Minnesota, and at that time there was a lot of concerns about acid rain and Congressman Sikorsky's interest in acid rain. So we spent a little time dealing with that, and then dealing with a number of senior care issues. As a result of that, we were able to get long-term care insurance option for federal employees that which occurred, I believe, in 1986 or 87. I don't remember exactly. So for me, it was a very interesting time to learn a little bit about politics, learn a little bit about how Washington, D.C. works, and to be kind of looking inside the tent as opposed to looking outside the tent. So that was kind of the first 10 years. The next 10 years, I went back to running the facility, went through another major expansion project, and decided that we were going to look to do some other things, some consulting and some other consulting issues that would have perhaps led to some management contracts. And at the time, there were some major changes in the regulatory and payment issues within the long-term care sector. So I ended up doing a couple of consulting projects and a couple of recruitment projects for a healthcare organization. And I guess they got tired of paying my hourly rate, and they opened up an operations position and asked me to apply for it. I did it with the assumption that I'd be there for 2 years, ended up staying almost 15 for a lot of reasons, but it was interesting work. It was a good chance to practice my profession, and it got me exposed to the academic side. During those 15 years, we created a master's level training program for our 40 administrators based on a college curriculum. And it connected me with St. Joseph's College at the time because they were the subcontractor that was working on it. So as a result of that, I started doing some remote training and remote teaching for them back in around 2011. When I left the Benedictines in 2015, I guess, they had an opening for the program director. So I decided I would try that for 2 years, and I've been there since about 2015.
And bouncing around or having a foot in academia, public policy, but also as an operator must make for some unique perspectives. Do you find that your diverse background is well received depending on where you are in academia? Is it something that people seek your opinion, or do they find you kind of a person who hasn't dedicated his life to one thing? I've worked in academia myself, also a CNA myself, and also come from marketing. Sometimes I'm viewed with a little bit of skepticism.
Well, I think I've got feet in probably 3 camps. Obviously, in the academic area, we do extensive work with students. We do a little research. We do some other things in that area. On the provider side, my family's still involved. I'm still involved with my family businesses. So I have that perspective. But I've also had the challenge of being a caregiver. I've taken care of both of my parents. I had a mother-in-law with Alzheimer's. We did some work with the organization she was working with. So I understand it from all three perspectives. I understand what everybody has to contribute and what the challenges are from that standpoint. Whether or not people respect it, like it, don't like it, it really doesn't matter to me. Yeah, I have a pretty thick skin, and I'm not really concerned about what other people think or want to think about what I am or I'm not doing. I do things because I think it's the right thing to do, and I find it of interest.
Well, that leads me into my next question, which is, there were things from your book that I have here, Pratt's Long-Term Care: Managing Across the Continuum, going into its fifth edition. But also, I think I discovered you through Vision 2025.
Mm.
Is there anything? I guess my question is, how did you get into writing such an extensive book? And then how did you get into Vision 2025? Because I feel like you must step on some people's toes in one of those projects. You're not afraid. The word's not controversy, but you're very direct in your writing. You're direct with
Mhm.
your critiques. You're direct with
Mhm.
your challenges. Has any of that come up in either one of those projects?
Well, I can rub people the wrong way. There's no question about it. But again, I'm not concerned that people want to approve me or don't approve me. It doesn't really matter. So back in the mid '90s, I was working with the NAB group, which is the National Association of Representing Licensure Boards for Nursing Home Administrators across the country. In fact, I chaired their exam committee for 3 years. And as part of that, it got me wondering, what are we doing to train new administrators going forward? And I had a chance to look at a lot of the research and the demographics of the individuals coming through. And again, if you look at my liberal arts background, I'm always asking questions. Why is this happening this way? And so we tried to do some research and do some analysis of it. And we basically came to the conclusion that most of the individuals coming into long-term care positions, it's a second or third or even a fourth career. And they're coming through it with limited academic background, which quite frankly, can get you quite a ways in long-term care. But getting an academic background, having additional background and training gives you a better understanding of things like evidence-based practices, how research impacts things, what are the key topics that we need to be concerned about, and looking at a bigger picture. So that was kind of a start of a journey that I took. Um, when I got into leadership positions at the American Healthcare Association, we started a group called Future Leaders, and we put together a training session for individuals, primarily younger individuals, but it wasn't really limited to that, to get them to go through the Stephen Covey training of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And the reason we did that is my observation of the long-term care sector is that we've been highly reactionary. We react to everything rather than take action on things. And the Covey principles really talks about being much more in control of your destiny, much more in control of yourself. And the 7 habits gave us a common language to talk to individuals within the senior care sector about. So we've trained about 500 individuals since we started this training program back in 2004. So that, again, that's part of this journey that I've been on. And then I had an opportunity to do some presentations and to sit with other individuals from DC. And I happened to be on a panel with the CMS administrator back in the mid 2000s. And after the panel, I asked her, what has CMS done to take a look at leadership in long-term care facilities? I said, don't you think that they may have some impact on quality? And she looked at me like I was from outer space and basically said, why would we care about that? All we want to do is pass rules and regulations and survey that in your compliance. And so, again, that's part of this journey of saying, there's got to be a better way of doing things, and the way that we're training individuals and providing leadership in these facilities. So that led me to a colleague of mine, Doug Olson, who is a professor at University of Wisconsin Eau Claire. And about 5 years ago, he went on a sabbatical to look at this basic topic about where are we going with the academic training for senior care leaders. And when I say senior care leaders, I'm not limiting it to nursing home administrators or even assisted living administrators. There are 5 basic, maybe 6 categories of individuals that the senior care sector needs leaders. Obviously in skilled nursing, obviously assisted living, but remember we've got home care, hospice, and daycare, and then we've got this huge emerging senior living leadership needs going forward. So Dr. Olson put together his sabbatical, came out with recommendations. One of the recommendations is to convene a group of interested stakeholders, and that resulted in Vision 2025. So we're on our 3rd symposium. We're bringing together academics, providers, and associations to talk about how do we develop senior care leaders to meet the needs in 2025 and beyond. So our next symposium will be in June. We have just incorporated this into a new 501c3 that we've been rolling out in the next 6 weeks. And anytime you can get 8 national associations that represent the diversity in the senior care sector together to say, yes, this is something we need to work on, it's a pretty interesting accomplishment.
It sure is. That's how I found you now, and I did read through the same paper that you mentioned. There's some big names on the steering committee and involved with Vision 2025. I know you're, in the earlier stages of it. Remind me again, when did you say the idea started to become concrete?
Yeah, it was about 5 years ago when Dr. Olson went on sabbatical, and then he published his report. And it'll be almost 3 years ago, we started a Vision 2025 group. And this will be our 3rd symposium coming up. All of them, last year was virtual because of COVID, but the first one was in person. We brought 140 people to Chicago. And as a result of that, we end up with 3 basic goals that we're trying to achieve in the short term. First, we're trying to get the senior care sector to agree to 1,000 paid AIT internships at the end of an individual's college academic program. Second, we want to get 25 sustainable senior care academic programs geographically dispersed across the country. And we want to have 15 partnerships between providers and academia to help craft scholarships, help craft programs, curriculums, write books, whatever else it takes at that point in time.
How likely are you to achieve these goals, and what has been the reaction? Because according to the paper, you want diverse interests involved in this, not just long-term care. It seems like you want people from civil society, from communities. So what's the biggest challenge, and what's been the feedback from people so far?
Well, I think, quite frankly, I think COVID set us back, like it set everybody back. A lot of what we do in life is about relationships and about connections with relationships. And, doing video conferences, doing, podcasts are all great, but eventually you've got to look people in the eye and across the table. So we're hoping that our symposium, which is going to bring together, again, another 130, 140 people. The outcome of this symposium is to have providers and academics walk away with partnerships and connections set over the next 12 months. We can work on the AIT, the paid AITs, the scholarships, and the other programs from that standpoint. The barrier, there are really no barriers. People have said this is a good idea. We should do this. It's a matter of time and getting the right people in place. I don't think that the goals we've set, the 3 basic goals, are not an Everest to climb. They're certainly a mountain to climb, but they're all doable, and we're well on our way of meeting those goals. I take a look at a number of programs that are out there already, and Dr. Olson's program in Eau Claire is probably one of the models that we look at to use. He's graduating 50 students a year with a 4-year academic degree and a 1-year paid internship at a provider community. And he has no problems finding locations to put these students in. So it's doable. We just need to get out there, work with providers, work with academics. The questions come up is, how do we do this? How do people do this? What? I don't know anybody at the college. How do I make a connection? So um, we're not billing it as a speed dating, but if you think of a speed dating model in this coming symposium, that's essentially what we're going to do. We're putting people together at tables, we're making introductions, and we're turning them loose to develop the relationships.
Stephen, I want to go back to when you became an administrator and now what education looks like. In hindsight, were there things that you wished you had received and you didn't, and today we're doing well, or have we not made as much progress as you'd expect?
Well, if I go back to when I started the program at the University of Minnesota, and they're actually celebrating their 50th anniversary this fall, and I wouldn't call myself a hoarder, but I retained the work that I did back in the mid 70s at the graduate program at the university. And I was reading one of the papers I did on quality, and quite frankly, you know, the work that we did back in the mid 70s and the papers we wrote have applicability to what we're doing today. Quality is an interesting journey for organizations to take, and I think we've probably refined the whole discussion about quality since that period of time, because we've got a lot more interest in how quality systems work. You mentioned Master Examiner from AHCA. That's a program that uses the Malcolm Baldrige criteria to evaluate the performance of a facility. And it takes you through the 7 basic steps that they have within Baldrige, and talks about all those areas that you need to assess yourself. Baldrige is essentially a self-assessment program that you then turn over to outsiders to take a look to see if you're really doing what you said you were going to do. And I got involved with that as a little bit part of my academic work, but a lot of it in this journey of trying to understand how do we get better outcomes for our facilities and our operations.
Stephen, in terms of curriculum or teaching, what are the courses that you teach? Are you much more on the research side of things?
Research is a small part of what I do. I'm teaching a lot in the policy and procedures area, a lot of public policy issues. I do a financial management class. I do some health information technology classes. And then if we have needs in other areas, I've taught some leadership classes. I've taught some clinical classes. So I've kind of got a broad background, but I like the public policy area and the financial management area as my primary focus.
What types of students are coming into your program? And if you could tell me if it's changed over the years, what are their interests and what are they trying to do afterwards?
Well, if you take a look at the program at St. Joe's, about 95% of the students are in this category where it's a second or third career. They might be working in a facility as maybe a social worker or as a concierge. I get a lot of students from New York that are working at 600 and 700 bed facilities, and they're working in hospitality and some other areas. So they've had exposure to senior care, and they want to get licensed, or they want a different credential. So that's the bulk of our students. We do get the 4-year and the MHA students, but most of them are second, third career students.
And what are the I guess, what's their learning curve if they're already coming with an aspect of at least care or some aspect of healthcare? What are the things that they are learning from you, either about long-term care or about leadership?
Well, they're probably getting again, depending on which classes they're taking, their curriculum, they're probably getting a pretty good background of how the oversight and the regulatory and the survey system and how operations work in a long-term care facility. Again, that's from financial management all the way through. The leadership courses are probably less emphasis for a student that has perhaps been out in the field as opposed to the 22 or 23-year-old that's coming out that needs much more. The most the 23-year-old has done is probably supervised two people at Subway. So they need a lot more seasoning. They're going to get that probably in an AIT as opposed to a class. You can teach leadership theory, but until you have it, you have to be practical about it and get out in the field. And how do you deal with people and how do you teach people? I've probably in my collection, if you look behind me, I probably got 50 books on leadership. And, there's a thematic thread that runs through all of them. And I'm a believer in what Covey talks about. I'm a believer in what Jim Collins talks about in terms of his level 5 leadership. I'm a big believer in an author by the name of Doug Conant, who wrote a book called Touch Points. All of them focus in on the leader as being subservient to the rest of the employees. That is, they're this servant leader that takes care of the individuals and creates a culture that helps everybody get uplifted in the process, as opposed to the autocrat or the authoritarian type of leader from that standpoint. So we've kind of got off on that leadership tangent, but that's philosophically the way that I've taken a look at the research and take a look at the writings that have been done out there.
I, as a former academic myself and a person who's published, not finished as big a book as you, I'm interested in your creative process. The chapters that I read, you start almost every chapter with a quote from a famous business author, Peter Drucker, as you mentioned, Collins. What does your process look like from a research point of view, from the actual writing point of view? And I guess I'm going to let you take the question any way you want. I'm interested in, where do you find new information? I find that a lot of times in long-term care, it's a regurgitation of something that someone wrote from 2 years ago and just republishing it on the internet.
Well, it's a great question. And quite frankly, I get this question from students: how did you find out about this? And I spend a good part of my morning going through a bunch of clipping services. I mean, I have, all of the trade publications. I have subscriptions to the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, all the different clipping services I take a look at. And I'm looking for tidbits and I'm looking for snippets of information to be able to follow up on. So that's basically what I do. I have a systematic process of looking for information. And one of my skill sets is be able to take information, process it, and be able to apply it in another area. I don't know how I do it. It just kind of sticks in my mind, and all of a sudden, two things will come together. It'll create a fourth issue that I need to talk about. So what I do with my students is we spend a lot of time on assignments, and I give them a lot of materials to work on. So one of the classes for this week is on legal and ethical issues. And so we spend a lot of time talking about, what are the responsibilities of a leader to help guide the residents and the family members through the legal and ethical issues. Whether it's a MOLST form or a POLST form or health directives. What about guardianship? What about POA? So we intersperse those issues into a discussion about legal and ethical responsibilities of a senior care leader.
I was going through some of kind of your kind of classroom questions at the end of each chapter, and you asked some thought-provoking questions, and I'll tell you what this question made me think. It says, what are some of the ways in which long-term care leaders can act proactively to improve the overall system?
Mhm.
I find that a lot of the executives that I speak to, whether it be on camera or off camera, tends to be, I wouldn't I would say they lean towards skepticism or lean towards pessimism of improving the overall system, whether because they don't know if the politics can do it, if the system's broken, or they're worried about staffing. I'm interested if you think do your students think that they can improve the overall system, and do you've been in this industry a lot longer than I have.
Well, Covey talks about things in terms of spheres of control, spheres of influence, and spheres that and things that are outside your control. What happens in Washington D.C. We've got trade associations that are representing us. They're doing the best they can do. My philosophy, and this goes back to the work that we've done with Baldrige, is that you work locally. You work locally to address the issues that you can lead and that you can manage. When I was with the Catholic organization, we had 7 facilities that achieved the highest HC Baldrige Award, which is the Gold Award. And it's a pretty intensive process to go through. And what we found with those 7 buildings is that when we arrayed the metrics for all 40 buildings, these 7 buildings were at the upper echelon, the upper 75th percentile of every metric that we looked at: financial, regulatory, quality indicators, resident satisfaction, employee satisfaction. And what happens in these situations is the culture of the facility changes from a situation where, A, we're trying to comply with regulations, to how are we achieving the best possible outcomes for the areas that we're working on. So at the end of the day, you need to work locally. What happens in St. Paul, in my case, or Augusta, Maine, or Washington, D.C., is going to happen irrespective of what I do on a day to day basis. I can only do with the stuff that I can control and work with on a day to day basis.
How often do you still have an active role inside of a long-term care organization, whether it be your families or as a consultant?
I'm probably doing something every week with somebody. I'm on the board of a couple of organizations, and so we keep track of that. My family operations, I keep track of what's going on. Um, because of COVID and my workload, my consulting practice has been somewhat diminished. It's very difficult to get people excited about, working on quality issues when they're dealing with an outbreak. So the consulting has been limited over the last 18 months, but I'm talking to people on a regular basis. I'm talking with students that are in buildings on a regular basis. I have 2 practicum students right now that we do weekly discussions about what they're seeing in the building. So I'm staying pretty connected.
In starting to wrap things up, Stephen, I'm
Mhm.
interested in the challenges that you see in the upcoming future for your students. I hear on a regular basis the type of residents that are coming into long-term care have changed. The margins are thinner. We have a staffing crisis. We're coming out of COVID. Country's extremely polarized. What do you think? I guess I don't know how to phrase the question. My question is, are you optimistic about the future? Are your students optimistic about the future for long-term care?
You have to be optimistic to work in long-term care. You have no choice. And the way that you pose the question is the same question we had in 1975. We were in the midst of change at that point in time. We had federal regulations coming on. Financial management was changing. We went from a price-based reimbursement system based on counties to a state-based, cost-based reimbursement. The first meeting I ever went to in 1975, I walked into the meeting. Everybody was in a hub because they were going to cost-based reimbursement. And somebody stood up and said, if we go to cost-based reimbursement, everybody's going to be out of business in a year. Didn't happen. And so this gets back to this, you know, um, victim mentality, the panic that people have about things that are outside their control. Hey, control the stuff you can control and deal with the stuff that you can deal with at a later date. Um, long-term care is evolving like everything else in healthcare is evolving. If we had more time, I could go chapter and verse about how healthcare has evolved. I'm a big student of history. You go back in the 1870s, and we have a fort in Minnesota called Fort Snelling, which was out on the edge of the Indian Territory at that point in time. They have some great displays down there, but they have a great pharmacy down there. And I've been down there a number of times. In the 1870s, bloodletting was the key way of treating just about everything. And if you think about the typical barber pole with red, blue, and white, that was because barbers were surgeons, and surgeons were judged on how much blood they had on their aprons. So that surgeons didn't get organized until about 1910. So think about how things have evolved in healthcare over the last 150, 160 years.
Mm.
So long-term care has only been around for about 75 years. And, we've got a long evolution to go for. The biggest challenge, quite frankly, is public policy makers come to the realization that you got 77 million boomers coming down the road. In 2026, the first ones start turning age 80, period. And that's twice as many as we have today. If we can't take care of them today, we can't finance them today, what are you going to do when you got twice as many of them? So that's the big challenge for public policymakers, is most of them are clueless. They don't understand it. The boomers are going to have expectations and needs, and there'll be a clash politically going forward.
I'm glad you mentioned that you are passionate about history, because the chapter that I read in the beginning of your book from Pratt's Long-Term Care is a historical overview of a lot of things that I didn't know. For none other less than if you're interested in the breadth of research that you did, your footnotes were good. I'm going to wrap up my last question, Stephen, with is, what is one lesser known resource that I can go to today online?
Well, you froze up there, so I don't know.
Any suggestions?
Well, I think, quite frankly, the Institute of Medicine's work from 86, from about 91, and the one that they did 2 weeks ago, quite frankly, are all good resource material. And it gives you a pathway of what needs to happen. I'd mentioned the National Academy's book of 2 weeks ago for people's reading, because there's a 605-page version and a 24-page version. Read the 24-page version, but you need to understand you need to take the whole 24 pages as whole. And the challenge is that people are going to want to pick and choose what they like in it. You got to pick the whole thing out at once. And it's everything from, we need to move into the 21st century technology. We need to improve nursing assistants. We need to improve education. And we need to have a much more collaborative regulatory process. I mean, that's 24 pages of information that is a good roadmap between now and 2025.
Stephen, I read the majority of the 605 pages, and definitely the 24. I'm very happy that you mentioned it. I had the opportunity about 2 weeks ago to interview the president of Leading Age National and Leading Age Georgia about that book, and it's definitely the first thing to pick up. And I also, I'm not selling your book. I don't make any commissions off of your book on Amazon, but it is very, very good, Stephen. Thank you so much for joining me on LTC Heroes. I hope we can connect soon. Thank you so much.
All right, Peter, we'll see you. Thanks for talking.